Welcome to Put It to the Test, the podcast taking the best evidence for positive lifestyle change and testing it real time, week by week. My name is Cameron Suter, here with my father, Derek Suter, and together our hope is to encourage and inspire you on your journey to lifelong health.
There are endless approaches to health. Finding the best path forward can feel overwhelming, I know. Instead of wading through the sea of restrictive diets and exercise programs, let's try something different. What if there is a way to not only lose weight, but to gain a lifestyle that allows for sustained, ongoing, and ever-increasing well-being? I'm going to put it to the test. This podcast chronicles my own journey with the support of my son to adopt a truly healthy lifestyle.
So join us as we discuss the factors that play into health from an easily digestible layman's perspective. All things from habits and mindsets to nutrition and exercise. And with that, let's get started.
Hello, welcome to the Put It to the Test podcast. I'm Derek Suter along with my son Cameron Suter, where we're going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts associated with getting started into the plant-based lifestyle, consuming more plants. And that's what we're really going to focus on today, the benefits associated with that. One of the things that Alicia, my wife, and I have come across are how do you take what you usually would have eaten in a typical carnivore meat-based diet and transplant that into a plant-based diet. And some of the products that we've found are substitutions, basically, a plant-based substitute for a meatball. So what have you found along those lines that you've worked with?
Yeah, that's a really great thing to think about because when you're thinking about transitioning a lifestyle or diet toward plant-based, sometimes it's not a matter of trying all these new bizarre foods that you've never had before, but just finding new ways of preparing your old favorites.
Right.
So I know our family would often have spaghetti and meatballs or spaghetti and bolognese sauce growing up. And that was something that I really enjoyed. But it's been cool to see that there are a lot of products available now that are plant-based that can fill that kind of dietary or meal niche that we really enjoyed. And I think you guys had been purchasing and exploring some new items around that, right?
Exactly. And what we wanted to do is find things that were familiar to us and at the same time economical too. Spaghetti and meatballs is a very economical meal. One of the pasta substitutes we found is a chickpea-based product called Bonza. And it's basically chickpeas, pea starch, tapioca, and xanthan gum. Now, I'm not sure exactly what xanthan gum is. I'm sure it's some sort of an ingredient. I've seen it on hundreds of ingredient labels, so I'm not concerned about what that is. But that's one of the products that we've found. Another product we've found that is a great pasta substitute is Veggie Craft Farms Rotini, and it's made with lentils, peas, and cauliflower. That's it. Those are some of the things that we've found. We just combine that with a jar of Prego Garden Combo Chunky Sauce. And there are some other things that are available too. Again, we've mentioned Dr. Michael Greger and his cookbook, and he has a recipe for nutty parm, and it's basically almonds, Brazil nuts, nutritional yeast, and a spice blend that he has a recipe for too. The meat substitute that we use for that is from a company called Gardein. It's available in the freezer section, plant-based meatballs. 3 meatballs has 160 calories, and they're big. They're actually good size.
Yeah.
By the time you get a serving of 3 of those, you've got a lot of a meal right there. Protein on that, 15 grams of protein.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
So we like these products. But what makes this a healthier option as far as plant-based foods are concerned?
Yeah, I think that's the kind of the million-dollar question in all of this. And this is something that we'll get into as we kind of discuss the the meat, so to speak, of nutrition here. And the question of is something healthy or what makes something healthy, what makes a plant-based product healthy, is a bit of a nuanced discussion. And it depends on a couple things. The first thing I think we've maybe discussed a little bit in the past is healthy relative to what? Because sometimes we want to just ask like a blanket statement of, is something good for me? Yes or no? And the reality is that anything can be better or worse for us relative to another food item. So in the case of the plant-based meatballs that you've been enjoying, like those are a good source of protein. They fill that dietary niche of wanting to have just a familiar meal. And they also, being more plant-based, have lower saturated fats. So relative to meatballs that are made from beef or pork, those would have higher saturated fats, which can impact your cholesterol levels negatively. And animal products themselves have some dietary cholesterol that you avoid when you have a plant-based option. Are the plant-based meatballs probably the healthiest thing relative to other whole foods? Maybe not, but they can serve a role. And I think that's something we want to iterate when we talk about all this, is that we don't need to be absolutist in our approach to health to where it's like, well, I can only have the healthiest foods of all time comprising my diet as a whole. It's okay for things to kind of exist in a middle ground of, well, this is maybe healthier than some options, and maybe there are some options that are even healthier than this, but we don't need to be striving for perfection when progress is something that's more sustainable for us.
Right. We're looking for a balance while not depriving ourselves of some flavor options also. So one of the things you mentioned there was whole food.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you mean, exactly what do you mean by whole food?
Yeah, and that's a key distinction to make because a lot of times when people claim to be vegan or plant-based, to me that only tells you what you don't eat. It tells me that you don't eat animal products. As we've discussed and alluded to before, there are a lot of plant-based products that are probably not the healthiest options. You can think of Oreos, French fries, and even like going into the special plant-based section and buying oat milk ice cream. It's like those are maybe treats, those are indulgences, and they have a place, but they are not what we would consider a whole food. So then what is a whole food, and why is that kind of a necessary proviso to consider in this?
Sure. So when I think of a whole food, I think of something that grows naturally
Right.
with not much processing to it. If you buy French fries at McDonald's, yes, that's a vegetable. It seems to me there would be a lot of additives to make that a McDonald's French fry compared to a raw potato or something that you would cook at home that doesn't have a lot of processing to it.
Right. And I think you hit on the key aspect of it, which is processing. And much like the question of is something healthy and how the answer to that kind of exists on a sliding scale, what qualifies as a whole food also exists on a sliding scale. So you can think of a potato is a great example, actually, because you can think of just a whole potato out of the ground, cleaned up, maybe baked. And you could add some sauces which have a bit of processing to them, but that potato itself is a whole food. And contrary to what we sometimes think of as just a normal white potato, maybe not being the most nutrient dense thing, there actually are some really great nutrients in a plain old white potato. There's great fiber and all these things. But you can move that sliding scale in the other direction in progressive ways. So you can think of French fries, which might be somewhere in the middle where it's still a discernible piece of potato.
Yes.
But it's been processed such that it's deep fried. And so you're adding oil and some other things that are themselves processed and refined.
Right.
But you could take it even further and you could isolate specific starches and proteins from it to make certain products. You could see this in corn as another great example, because you could have a whole food of corn on the cob, and then further down that process scale, the further away you get from its whole form, you can isolate the starches and make corn syrup from it. And that's very far removed from the whole food. And because of that, it's being stripped of a lot of its nutritive properties.
Right. All the way from fresh corn on the cob down to a Dorito.
Right. And it's interesting to think, if anyone listening here hasn't yet adopted the whole plant-based lifestyle, which, as we've said, is not the only way to experience health, you can experience whole and processed versions of food of animal products as well. So think of the difference between a lean chicken breast and then to chicken nuggets, or, I mean, even hot dogs sometimes include beef, pork, and poultry. It's a whole smorgasbord of the barnyard, in addition to spices. And I watched a video of how it's made, hot dogs, which is an enlightening experience if no one's seen it. But they actually add corn syrup, which we just discussed, to hot dogs.
Right.
So there are whole food and more processed, refined versions of animal products as well. So regardless of what lifestyle you adopt for yourself, trying to lean increasingly toward whole foods, and as we'll discuss in this episode, whole plant foods, is such a boon to your health.
The bottom line is looking at the ingredient label on any food that you would purchase, regardless if it's a plant-based product or if it's even a meat product. Because to go back to your hot dog, it says meat and meat byproducts and fillers.
Mm-hmm.
So you're getting a very highly processed product here that may not contain a lot of meat because it's going to contain some fillers. And these fillers are often plant-based fillers, but that doesn't make it healthy intrinsically itself as a even healthy meat option.
Correct.
It's a product highly processed that you're purchasing. What you're saying is that same principle applies to plant-based products. They may be plant-based, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily whole food or even healthy options for you.
Right. That's entirely correct. And the bringing up the nutritional labels is a great way to think about it. When you see a product that has a laundry list of ingredients and you don't recognize what most of those are, if they have like 5 or 6 syllables and they sound like something out of a science textbook, that's probably the sort of thing that we're wanting to lean away from, which again, it's not a dogmatic thing of I can never have this thing. We don't want to necessarily villainize foods, but to realize that what matters most is what we do most often. And if most of our diet is leaning toward food as it's represented in nature, it's as close to its whole form as possible, that's going to do a lot for our health. A lot of those additional ingredients that you'll see and maybe struggle to pronounce are stabilizers, added sugars, added oils, all of which basically serve to make the food more palatable, or as we sometimes refer to it, as hyper palatable, being as flavorful, as kind of addicting as possible so that they can sell it more, and also to make it shelf stable. So if you want to have a kind of a simple, I won't call it a hack, maybe just a little practice to think about when you're in the grocery store, how to move toward more whole food options, at least in our grocery stores, a way that they're laid out is that a lot of the processed foods are in those center aisles where you have things with like cereals, crackers, all these things that have some maybe added sugars, added fats. And again, this isn't about saying that you cannot go into those aisles, you cannot have any of those products, but maybe to look at your grocery list and just to observe and see how much of what I'm buying is from those center aisles versus how much I'm buying from the produce section, or if you're buying animal products from the meat counter where you're going to find foods in their more whole form. And that can just be a simple way of wanting to bring a higher quality to your overall grocery list, is just spending more time where the foods are in their whole form.
Okay, so we've got a lot of terms floating around here, and I know it can be confusing to some people,
Mm-hmm.
and to a certain degree it still is to me as I'm new to all this and sorting it out. I've got a basic understanding, but we've got vegetarian or vegetarianism, we've got veganism, and we've got plant-based.
Right.
So between all of these terms, where do we fall? What's the difference between all of this, and how can we navigate through all these options for what works for us individually?
Right. Yeah, another really good question, and it's easy to kind of feel like we're drowning in a sea of terms these days, especially as new diets pop up, fad diets pop up. You have low carb, no carb, keto, paleo, all these things, and it gets confusing. We'll knock the first one, which is probably the easiest one, out first, which is vegetarian versus vegan. Vegetarian means that you don't eat meat. So there's some qualifiers where people say they're like lacto-ovo vegetarians, which means they also eat dairy products and egg. But generally speaking, when people say they're vegetarian, it means they don't eat meat, but they may eat other animal products. Vegan kind of takes that a step further. I'd say vegan plant-based, take it a step further and say we don't eat any animal products. So if it comes from an animal, being its meat, milk, eggs, those are not things that those people would eat. Honey is a little bit of a contentious product. Some people say, well, it comes from bees, but is it a part of bees? I don't know. I eat honey, but one of these things of like, you got to pick the hill to die on. But the
or the hill to live on.
Yeah,
in this
sure,
case.
sure. And all those distinctions are fair, but I think the more important one that you brought up is the distinction between veganism and plant-based. Dietarily, they may look the same, but to me, veganism more so describes an ethic. Often people who are vegan are living that lifestyle out of concern for the welfare of animals or the environment. You might hear people be more of advocates for those sorts of things. Really interesting topics, and it's something that I've spent some time on, but I tend to focus more on the nutritive health benefits of plant-based nutrition. If anyone is interested in learning more about those topics of the realities of like factory farming and animal welfare in our current cultural setup, or the impact of what we eat on the environment, a really good resource is a guy named Ed Winters. He has a channel on YouTube and various things across the web where he goes by Earthling Ed. And he was actually one of the guys that I listened to where he would just give like he would hold public little debates with people, just asking them their thoughts on veganism. And the questions that he brought up really challenged me. So on a personal level, I found his information meaningful. But what was most convicting to me and perhaps most motivating to me was learning about the plant-based nutrition benefits for my health. And so that's why I tend to describe myself as plant-based, although I'm in no way against someone referring to me as vegan. But to me, plant-based describes more exactly the things that I'm eating rather than bringing in some of the ethical topics.
Right. One of the things that we've mentioned previously on the Put It to the Test podcast is that we're not evangelizing any particular eating lifestyle.
Right.
We're promoting a plant-based lifestyle for ourselves, and that's what I'm putting to the test is how this will benefit me from a health standpoint.
Right.
By incorporating a plant-based lifestyle and making that predominantly what I do eat, that's where I'm gaining the health benefits. And if someone decides that that's not exactly for them, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same point, incorporate more plants into your diet along with whatever it is you're eating.
Right.
Even if you're still eating meats, consider eating more plants.
Yes.
And that in many ways can benefit you toward a healthier lifestyle. And I think that's a key for me because I still eat fish.
Mm-hmm.
We have some sort of whitefish once or twice a week, tilapia, seldom salmon. I'll continue to have tuna in my lunch once in a while too. I'm not going crazy with the fish, but I still enjoy that because I want another dietary option in my diet, and I enjoy the taste of it too. So I don't feel that I'm completely vegan, vegetarian, plant-based in that respect, but I've eliminated beef, pork, and poultry
Hmm.
and dairy from my diet. So I feel that I'm achieving a balance, and that's one of the things that we want to encourage people to do, is to look at what the options are and consider more plant-based nutrition items in your diet. So from a nutrition standpoint, what are those foods that you would consider to be, I've heard the term superfoods. What are those foods that you get the most nutritional bang for your buck
Hmm.
that people would like to know about? These foods are great, but what are those power foods that you would call them?
Yeah, superfoods. I laugh because it's one of those things where I feel like it's a little bit of plant-based PR, trying to do branding for certain foods that they want to elevate to be like, oh, you need this in your diet if you want to have the most health. And
Well, that's a great point. People are they're looking to all kinds of sources for their information. Help them navigate through that.
yeah, that's a good point. As we've discussed before, like, yeah, there are some foods that per calorie, per unit volume, they offer a ton of nutrition, but that food alone can't be the cornerstone of your entire diet. There has to be something a little bit more encompassing. So maybe we can just discuss kind of those nuts and bolts as you were discussing in the beginning here. And I think the core concept to understand revolves around this idea of caloric density versus nutritional density.
Get into that.
Yeah, more terms, but we'll break it down because this is, if we can understand this, I think this serves as a really important through line among whatever dietary choices you're making. So let's start with caloric density. This is simply a way of describing how many calories there are in a food per unit volume. So if you have, for example, a cup of food, the amount of calories in that cup will obviously differ depending upon what that food is. And some things have higher calorie density and other things lower. So if we look at plants, for example, a cup of iceberg lettuce, that's going to have maybe a calorie. I don't even know. Like, it's going to be very low. It has very low caloric density versus something like a cup of peanuts. Well, that's going to have probably a couple hundred calories because the macronutrients that comprise those foods are different. And we can discuss kind of carbs, fats, and proteins a little bit different. But just to understand that, okay, there's this caloric density of what I'm eating. And this is what you see reflected on a nutritional label where it says a serving size and how many calories. So that's its nutritional density. But the important thing to contrast that with is what's referred to as nutritional density. So you can probably carry forward where this is going, where you have an amount of food, a serving, and how many nutrients are in that serving of food. And while it's a little bit nuanced beyond this blanket statement, I think this serves as a good guide for us that we generally want to have as much nutritional density within our food and to have lower caloric density so that we are being filled, we have satiety, we feel full on fewer calories. Now, there is a little bit of nuance to that, of course, because we don't want to be depriving ourselves of calories that we need. But in the context of our conversation and weight loss and weight maintenance, if we can explore foods that have a lower caloric density that we can eat and feel full off of while having more nutrients in them, that's going to help us to maintain a healthy weight and to have all the nutrients that our body needs to thrive.
So it's kind of the concept of, you've heard the terminology, empty calories.
Yes, yes.
That foods that have a high caloric count but are low in nutritional density are considered to be empty calories, that they don't give you the nutrition that you need to sustain your bodily functions, but they have a lot of caloric density,
Hmm.
but they're not good for you nutritionally. Give an example of that.
Well, I think that ties directly back into our conversation about whole foods versus more processed foods.
Okay, make that connection.
Because whole foods are going to have, just by virtue of uh, not being processed and isolated out in different ways, per calorie of whole food, there's going to be more nutrition in its just natural form. But when you start to process it and pull out different parts of the food, you often strip the nutrients away from it. So you can think of like a whole grain, for example, say like wheat, for example. Like there's different vitamins and nutrients in whole wheat that will be stripped away when it's processed into,
Flour.
yeah, white flour that goes into crackers or things like that. An interesting indicator of this for plant-based foods is if there's fiber in it. So if you look at a nutritional label, or if you just have a plant in its natural form, it's going to come with fiber, which is really important for a lot of reasons. But you'll notice on more processed foods, like you look on the back of Ritz crackers, for example, there's maybe a gram of fiber, maybe not, but it's made from flour, so it should, but it's because of that processing and refinement that those nutrients and nutritional density have been lowered.
So, from my understanding, proteins are one of the building blocks that we need to help build our muscles. When you exercise, you basically break your muscles down and you need to replenish that with a protein. A lot of people have the understanding that dairy, meat, poultry, eggs, those type of items that aren't plant-based items have a lot of protein in them, that you need to get the protein. So I need my meat, I need my dairy, I need my eggs. Where do we find that in the plant-based world to make up that difference from the meat-based diet?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one of the most common concerns that people have when considering a plant-based diet. Some of those foods that are more protein dense, that are plants, tend to be things like beans, legumes. So you have any sort of bean, chickpea, split peas. That's actually where pea protein powder comes from for people who decide to use that supplement. But then also nuts, seeds, whole grains, even dark greens have a certain amount of protein. It may not be a lot, but a couple grams here or there, it can add up throughout the day. But it's interesting thinking about protein because maybe it's our aesthetic-driven culture that wants to think about building muscle and various things and the commercial aspects behind that. But protein can kind of be sometimes the sole focus, and it can be kind of put on a pedestal as like this macronutrient that's more important than the others. So I think it would be good if we understand what actually are protein requirements. What should I be looking to get on my dietary lifestyle, regardless of what's from plants or animal products. One of the helpful kind of equations that I've learned from Dr. Michael Greger, and he is citing various research papers to back this up that we can include in the show notes. But he cites that 0.8 to 0.9 grams of protein per kilogram of your ideal body weight is descriptive of how much protein your body needs.
So that sounds pretty technical to me. How do you figure that out?
Yeah, and especially since being here in the States, like we're in pounds. So an easier calculation that kind of gets around to the same thing is you take your ideal weight multiplied by 4 and divided by 10. By ideal weight, I mean your lean body mass. So if you have 20, 30 pounds of fat that you're looking to lose, you don't calculate your protein requirement off of that, but you base it off of your target weight. And there are some different online calculators that we can also link to that will help you determine what that number could look like for you. But I'll apply that to myself. I'm roughly 170 pounds, so multiplied that by 4 divided by 10 is around 68 grams of protein. And so that's the baseline of what I should be getting during the day to just help maintain my health. But there are, of course, instances where we might want to increase our protein intake. There's some interesting studies that suggest that as we get older, increasing that by a bit can be helpful. So people who are seniors might consider another 10, 20 grams of protein just to help maintain body mass. Physical activity is also another great reason to consider increasing your protein, because if you're in the gym, you're trying to build muscle, having more protein can help just facilitate that repair process that you alluded to. So I can maybe it'd just be helpful to give an example breakdown of what my protein looks like given the lifestyle that I'm trying to lead, to give you an idea of, okay, where does he get protein on a plant-based diet?
Right. I think that's going to be helpful, not only to me, but to a lot of other people that are considering a plant-based lifestyle too. Where do I get the protein that I need
Right.
to sustain healthy activity? And again, like you said, you need a balance. And it goes back to that idea of balance in your diet to find what you're calling the macronutrients, the carbohydrates, the fats, the balance of all of those, the sugars,
Yeah.
and what's involved in getting those nutrients. And something I'd like you to touch on in a future episode is breaking those down just a little bit further too, to go into the polysaturated fats, the monosaturated fats, the food sources for those, and the differences. We want to get into that, but we're going to do that in a future episode. So if you could go into what you're eating and what your protein sources are, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I would be happy to. I had made a little list of this just thinking about it beforehand. So I'll share what I have, how much protein is in it, and kind of the idea that I have about why I'm eating this way. So in the morning, I might go to the gym. I like to work out in the morning if I can. Then I come home and have a post-workout smoothie where I will use a little bit of a plant-based protein powder and maybe some almond milk or fruit to just blend up. And that usually has around 15 to 20 grams of protein. And I'll touch real quickly on protein powder because I think sometimes people can think that, oh, well, if you're a vegan, you have to have protein powder if you're going to get enough protein. But that's honestly not the case. I often don't do protein powder. It's something that I kind of decided to incorporate recently because there was a sale on Costco and I really like how it tastes.
Sure. And here's a key I want to put in here with that. It's considered a supplement.
Exactly.
It's not your main source. It's meant to fill in the gaps where you're not getting the protein or the other nutrients you need from a whole food.
It certainly can be used to fill in gaps, but I don't think a whole food plant-based lifestyle inherently has gaps.
Oh, that's a great point. See, you've cleared up a misconception for me.
Yeah, and if you think about it, with protein powder, if you go into any store, predominantly the protein powder sold are going to be whey-based. So they're not going to be plant-based. So to think that those on plant-based diets are using up all the protein powder to fill in a hole, it's like, well, most of the protein powders aren't even plant-based. So I like the word you use, it's supplemental. It can be useful for convenience. It can be useful for me, flavor. I love just the taste of a post-workout smoothie, but I'm able to get my protein without that if need be. It's just something that I've chosen to incorporate in.
Sure. And what are the rest of your protein sources throughout your day?
Right. So moving forward from there, that's my post-workout smoothie. Then I tend to have oatmeal for breakfast. I have it almost every day. I just love a bowl of oatmeal. It just keeps me full. I love the way it tastes. It's cheap to make. And I usually make mine with about a cup or so of oats. I'll use some soy milk, natural peanut butter. I'll throw in some flaxseed. And I actually really like to sweeten it with just a really ripe mashed up banana. Incorporating all that, that's around 30 grams of protein just from predominantly whole food in a bowl of oatmeal.
And the key is whole food, not the little packet that you get from the box and that you empty into the bowl
Right.
and add your water and do in the microwave. You're actually using whole oats.
Yes. If you are using those like just oatmeal packs, there's nothing wrong with them, but just understanding that they do come with added sugars and some other things that you might be able to get from other sources. such as banana for me. I know some people that may not feel like it's sweet enough for them, so they might add a packet of stevia or something, and there's flexibility with that. But again, that's 30 grams of protein, which is a substantial amount for just a bowl of oatmeal. And then maybe for lunch, I might make a tofu crumble, or it's kind of like a hash in a way where there's crumbled up tofu, spices, some veggies. It might be one of those things where it's like, yeah, a vegan would like that, but I do. But it's something that I've found is just a convenient thing for me to make. And I might have that with some whole grain toast or an English muffin, which equates to about another 30 grams of protein. Then moving forward, I might have some nuts or frozen berries. I really love just snacking on frozen berries for a snack throughout the day. And there's not much protein in the berries, but in the nuts, there might be 6 to 8 grams of protein per serving. And then dinner tends to be my biggest meal of the day, and that's where I get a lot of my protein. You brought up like the chickpea pasta, which I've been really enjoying too. So I might have some of that, roasted veggies like broccoli or something on the side. I might also have a salad. And that usually equates to somewhere around 35 grams of protein. So throughout the day, just through those sources I mentioned, I'm getting around 120 grams of protein. And that's fitting within my caloric goals, though I don't really track, but it's around 24 to 2,600 calories, which is great for where I'm at and the amount of exercise I'm doing daily. And it's able to more than supply for the needs I have. I feel satisfied. I don't feel hungry. I'm able to see progress in the gym. My recovery time is very good. And I don't feel like I'm depriving myself of anything.
Well, this has been great information. I'm so thankful that you've shared this with us. And what I'd like to do is in the next episode, go a little bit deeper into some of the foods and to explain, especially into the vegetable line, more of the nutritional benefits of more of the leafy green vegetables and the vegetable options that are available, and just getting a little bit more into focusing on how to utilize these whole foods into a plant-based lifestyle.
Right.
And I think that's really going to be beneficial to me and to some of our listeners as well, to help them educate themselves to, is this a great thing or is this a good thing for them to do? And how they can incorporate these different types of foods into their lifestyle and how they can benefit from it also.
Yeah, that's an excellent idea. If this is kind of the Nutrients 101 talking about caloric density and whole foods versus processed foods, I think following that up with a 102, 202 class. I don't know how they order the progression of classes, but talking about some of those specific items and getting more in depth to explain some of those terms. Like you also mentioned the poly and mono unsaturated fats versus trans fats versus all these things. I think clarifying that could be really empowering for people.
I think so, because the things that you've shared with me one-on-one have really opened my understanding of what foods that I had been consuming were doing to me, how they were contributing to my not so great health. I think this information is going to be helpful not only to me, but to a lot of other folks as well. Are there any other things that we need to know about as we move into this plant-based lifestyle?
Yeah, one thing that came to mind, and it came to mind as you were talking about how just this information has allowed you to make more informed choices. I think it's just helpful to understand that with any food choice, there are benefits and what I would call considerations. I think this is maybe a little bit more encompassing way of talking about the good and bad aspects of food, so to speak. Because any food can have the benefit at least of being enjoyable to eat, even if there's no nutritive properties about it that make it especially healthy. Being able to enjoy our food is important, but we need to balance the benefits of our food with the considerations of it, and this applies to everything. For example, with animal products, there absolutely are a lot of benefits that people can derive from eating animal products. We talked about some of the nutritive properties of there's more protein. It can be It's honestly just a normal part of most people's dietary choices, and it tastes good. I readily admit that. And when I am by barbecue joints, I start getting hungry just as anyone else. But of course, there are considerations with that. Maybe some of those are specific things we can discuss in another episode as well. But we touched on some of those being saturated fats that are found in a lot of animal products. They often come with cholesterol that can have negative impacts on us. And there are some other more specific compounds in meat that can have some consequences long term, especially on our cardiovascular health. But to be fair and even handed, I think it's important to talk about the considerations of a plant based diet because we don't want to be dogmatic and say, like, this is the only healthy way there is, and there's no considerations at all. I think the considerations that come with a plant based diet are very manageable. We touched on a big one with protein in that it's very easy to get more than adequate amounts of protein on a plant-based diet once you're aware of the sources and how to incorporate that into your lifestyle. There are two other areas that I'll just quickly note because these are some things that I would often hear as rebuttals against a plant-based lifestyle when I was learning more about this. The first of which is vitamin B12. People might say that you can't get vitamin B12 on a plant-based diet and therefore it's inferior and you shouldn't do it at all. I think that would be maybe throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. Just for context, vitamin B12, it's utilized throughout our body in various ways. And it's an essential vitamin, and it's also one that we need to get from an external source. Our body doesn't make it. It's actually made from bacteria in the soil and in nature of all places, which is where animal products get it. Say a cow that's allowed to graze out in a meadow or drink from a stream, it's ingesting a little bit of those natural compounds that allow it to have B12 in it. And then when we would eat the meat, we would be eating kind of that concentrated source of B12. But the cow itself isn't making it, it's getting it from another source. Of course, a lot of animals in the current factory farming system are being fed vitamins themselves because they're not grazing out in nature. But it begs the question then, okay, well, how am I going to get this through a plant-based diet? Maybe years ago, you'd get some B12 if you were growing all your veggies in the soil and getting a little bit of the natural compounds that way. But honestly, the easiest way now is just to supplement it. B12 is one of the cheapest as well as the most studied supplements that people can buy. It comes in a couple different forms. You might see it listed as cyanocobalamin or methocobalamin. Either's fine. Don't worry about the specific source. It's one of those things that is very important to consider supplementing if you are deciding to be fully plant-based. That said, it's also important for people who are maybe seniors over 65. It's recommended to get a bit more B12 as well. I'll share a couple specific numbers from the Nutrition Facts website that Dr. Greger leads. He shares that getting around 2,000 micrograms of B12 a week is ideal. I do that in 1,000 twice a week. It's just easy for me. And if you're 65 or older, you can do that 1,000 as a daily supplement. And that's honestly for vegans and non-vegans alike. Making sure that you have a consistent source of B12 can be very important. The other nutrient that can be important to consider is omega-3s. And we'll discuss these a little bit more when we talk about the polyunsaturated fats. But these are often the so-called heart-healthy fats that you might hear are in fish or other sources. The most concentrated plant-based sources are things like flaxseed, chia seed, hemp seeds, walnuts. You can also supplement it in pill form, and that comes from an algae source of all places. But if you are eating meats, omega-3s are often found in fish, such as tuna and salmon and those things, which I know you've enjoyed and I think are a good addition to your diet for where you're at. So those are just a couple things that are good to consider if you are thinking about being increasingly plant-based. Even if you're not, making sure that you're having consistent sources of these things can be good. There are, of course, further considerations just dietarily across the board that we can continue to discuss moving forward. But I think this maybe serves as a good intro to some of the major points to be thinking about just about our food in general. Again, to recap, we're thinking about wanting to maximize nutritional density while being conscious of the caloric density of our foods. We're wanting to shift our diet increasingly toward foods in their whole form and in being just intentional and mindful of the processed foods that we're eating. And we're wanting to understand what the sources of protein are from plants as well. That, again, even if you're not fully plant-based, incorporating more of those foods can have a lot of benefits to you as well.
Right. And again, this isn't meant to be overwhelming to anybody, but it's great information to understand of how this will benefit you. And hopefully, as we go along into this process and I learn more about it, as Cameron explains it so thoroughly, that we can get into some of the more nuts and bolts and make it easy to understand of how you can apply this to your specific lifestyle. We're not saying go out and start buying jars of flax seeds and chia seeds, and no, you don't have to eat a tablespoon of those every day. It's incorporating them into something that you're already doing. As simple as sprinkling something into your oatmeal or sprinkling something over your salad to add an extra crunch. So those are some of the practical applications that we can get into as we go further into putting this plant-based lifestyle to the test. And we hope you will join us again in the next episode of Putting It to the Test.